So the bluegrass bark. I actually don't really know why it's called the bluegrass bark, but it's just a phrase that people use to describe the sound that the mandolin makes on those backbeats. And the chop chord shapes are primarily what we use to make this sound. You guys probably know the basic idea. Once you know how to make the shape with your left hand, to make that bark, all you have to do is to lift your fingers off the strings directly after strumming the chord. So if you keep your fingers on the strings after lifting that pressure off, you'll be creating that muted sound, which is the percussive aspect of the chop that we're looking for. And the bottom line is we're trying to use this bark sound to add some rhythmic definition to beats 2 and 4 to contribute to this rhythmic grid that the entire band is slotting into. But even though this idea seems really simple at first, it's actually one of the most unique and identifiable aspects about a player's sound. I don't know about you, but when I'm listening to a record for the very first time and I don't know who's playing on it, I can sometimes recognize the mandolin player just by the sound of their chop alone, even if I haven't heard them play any melodic ideas. I can recognize Sam Bush's chop from a mile away. It sounds like a wet sock hitting an empty trash can. It's so good. And there are so many little aspects about how we play the chop chord that really factor into this sound. You know, things like how loud are we chopping, or how long are we holding out that chord before muting the strings? Are we pushing the beat or dragging behind the beat? You know, what are we even doing with our right hand through all this as well? And all that stuff is what we're going to look at in this video today. And to start off, the first step is to make sure that you're playing the right chords at the right time. Maybe that's kind of implicit, but for me, I got by for so long without knowing the chord progressions to the songs that I was playing. I was way more interested in learning the melody or taking a solo, which is kind of ironic because you need the chords and the information that's within the chords to be able to do any of that well. So I wasn't spending any time playing the chords, so I didn't memorize the chord progressions, and what I did to get by in the jam session was just mute the strings altogether to create this sound that some people call the dry chop, like this. And this is fine if you're new to the mandolin or if you're playing a new song at the jam session that you can't figure out the chords to. But eventually you want to move past this because this isn't the sound that we really want to have for our chop. For starters, it's a lot quieter than the normal bluegrass chop, so it's going to be harder to compete with the banjos and the fiddles in those really loud bluegrass jams. Second, there's no real tone to this chord, right? Because you're just hearing the plastic of the pick against the metal strings. You're not actually hearing the wood of the instrument. But most importantly, we really want to have some harmonic information in the chords that we're playing, right? Or in other words, the melody of whatever song you're playing is always going to relate back to the notes that are in the chords at any given time in the song. So when you play the right chords at the right time, you're going to offer more support to whoever you're backing up. Basically, you still want there to be some meat to the sound of the chord, even though the chop is mostly a percussive roll. So you're just going to hear the strings for a split second, but you want those strings to ring out. The question is, how long do you want these strings to ring out? And this is a really tricky balance to strike. If you mute the strings too early, it's not going to sound too much different from that dry chop we looked at earlier. But on the other end of the spectrum, if we let the chords ring out for way too long, first, it's going to sound really jangly, right? And second, it's going to take away from that rhythmic definition that we talked about earlier. It's really important for the chop chord to delineate a specific point in the measure where the beat is. And I think if you let the chord ring out too long, it's making the window too broad for that beat to fit in. In other words, the longer you hold out the chords, the easier it is to fluctuate, to speed up or to slow down, which is something we want to try to avoid. But I think there is a sweet spot somewhere in the middle where you can still get that rhythmic definition while letting the chord ring out a little bit more, and it just takes some time and experimentation to figure out where that is. It's almost a personal choice as well. Every mandolin player is going to have a different approach here, so what I'd recommend is going back and listening to some of your favorite mandolin players to see what they do. Better yet, if you can chop along with them on recordings, you're going to soak up some of those tendencies and incorporate them into your own playing. I think that's how we grow as musicians, just by taking bits and pieces from some of the people that we love. If you're interested in my approach, I tend to hold out the chop chord a little bit longer than some might, because I think it helps everything feel a little bit more relaxed, even if I'm playing at a really fast tempo or I'm playing ahead of the beat to push the band forward rhythmically. Which brings us to our next question, which is, where do you want to chop in relationship to that beat? I think one of the coolest things about bluegrass music is that it feels real, it feels authentic, and it feels exciting. And if you go back and listen to some of those classic canon bluegrass recordings, it might be kind of hard to map the tempo of those songs with a metronome. You know, the song feels like it has a life of its own. It breathes and it pauses and it speeds ahead. It's what makes it feel so authentic. But this doesn't give us an excuse to be lazy with our metronome work, because bluegrass music is one of the most rhythmically intentional music styles out there. And for the most part, those canon bluegrass recordings, they don't fluctuate willy-nilly. If you think about it, they usually start a little bit slower and they speed up and slowly ramp up as the recording goes on. And a huge part of this boils down to this mandolin chop, because I think most mandolin players are trying to chop ever so slightly ahead of the beat to keep pushing the band forward and forward and forward. So if you've never even thought about this before, I encourage you to go back and listen to those mandolin players again and see what's going on. And a great way to practice this again is just playing along with those recordings to get a feel for where those players are feeling the beat. But there are some things that we can do with the metronome as well to help us be more cognizant of what's going on and to exercise that rhythmic muscle a little bit more. So grab your metronome, try starting off with a really easy tempo like 120 beats per minute. And here we're going to feel a click for every single beat in our 4/4 measure. Now, instead of trying to chop directly on top of that click, and instead of just trying to go off to the races, not thinking about what's going on at all, we're going to keep in sync with the metronome, but we're just going to move our own little personal metronomic grid an inch ahead of where the metronome is. So that way we're staying consistently with the metronome, but just a little bit ahead of it. Once you've done that, for the sake of leaving no stone unturned, we're going to do the exact opposite. Let's try playing slightly behind the beat now. So we're not trying to drag the music down, and we're not going to lose the structure of the metronome at all. All we're going to do is move our metronomic grid just slightly back to make everything feel a little bit more relaxed. If you're a metronome nerd like me and you want to take this a step further, a good thing to do is to see if you can feel that same tempo with fewer clicks. That way you're training yourself to fill in the gaps internally. So instead of playing at 4 clicks a measure at 120, cut that BPM in half so that you're feeling 2 clicks a measure now. Or even harder, you can feel 1 click a measure at 30 BPM. So at first, it might be hard to even hear these subtle differences, much less pull these off. But if you can do these exercises proficiently, you're going to have much more control and efficiency in how you play these chop chords. You can control the rhythm of the band by these slight differences. But I think what helps us most in this area is just figuring out what our personal rhythmic tendencies are and trying to weigh our tendencies against the tendencies of those people that we're playing with. As a personal example, I actually tend to play a little bit behind the beat, and that's something I'm trying to get better at. And oppositely, our bass player in Mile 12, Nate, tends to play ahead of the beat. And it's something we are open about and honest about with each other, and it's something we talk about a lot to try to find that middle ground where we can meet in the center to better build that rhythmic grid for the rest of the band to play on. So just being aware of those tendencies can be enough, but if you're looking for more, what I'd recommend doing is playing in a group of people with a metronome going. And this might take a lot of metronome nerds getting together at once, but it's totally worth it, because instead of measuring your own personal rhythmic preferences against another person's preferences, you're both measuring your tendencies against a standard of perfection. So there's nowhere to hide. In particular, if you're playing in a band and you do this often, it's going to help solidify almost everything about your performance. But let's talk about the right hand now, because we still haven't played these chords too much, and the right hand is really the last piece of the puzzle to make all these other pieces fit together. If you're just starting to play backup on the mandolin for the first time, you might be finding that the right hand and all these pick directions might be pretty confusing. But basically, what we're trying to do is line up our downstrokes with the beats in the measure to best accent the music that we're playing. This is the same technique that we want to use whether we're strumming on chords, whether we're playing double stops, or we're playing single note melodies. And I actually made a video about that very topic. If you haven't seen it already, I definitely recommend checking it out in the link above. So since the mandolin chop happens on that backbeat, or beats 2 and 4, since those are numbered beats in the measure, we're just going to play those with downstrokes. It's that easy. But the temptation is going to be to stop moving your hand in between those chop strums when there's other beats that happen in between the chops. And you want to make sure that you're not dropping beats. Otherwise, you're not going to be moving your right hand at the same pace or frequency of the music. If you're embodying the tempo this way and moving your hand down even in between the chop chords, you're going to be embodying that tempo, and it's going to be a lot easier to stay in time with the music. Also, I find it's easier to transition from playing chords to playing melody, which is something we have to do a lot in bluegrass, whenever I'm moving my hand at that same pace. If I have to double time my hand when I'm going from chords to melody, it feels pretty unnatural, and I usually end up fluctuating in tempo. So an easy way to keep your right hand in line when you're playing these chop chords is just to add an extra downstroke on beats 1 and 3, only on your G string. That way the chop chord still is the primary feature of what you're playing. And this is the basic strum template that I would recommend starting out with. And oftentimes you don't need anything more than this. Sometimes less is more. And if you add in a bunch of extra upstrokes in between those chops, it might make everything sound really muddy, and it's going to be harder to keep the tempo steady, or it's going to be hard to get that rhythmic definition that we keep talking about. But as you get used to this, there are a few strum variations that you can start to add in to spice things up. And by the way, if you'd like a PDF transcription of the notation for all these strum patterns, you can get it over on my Patreon site, where you'll find a bunch of other stuff that you can't find here on YouTube, like chop chord diagrams, tune transcriptions, bonus lessons, private video exchanges. So be sure to check it out at the link above. First up, let's try adding in a little upstroke after the 4th beat in the measure. So you'll be doing all downs except for 1 up right before restarting the measure. Next, we're going to try adding in that upstroke after the 2nd beat, or after the 1st chop in the measure. So it should be down, down, up, down, down. Let's try combining those two together, and we'll add upstrokes after the 2nd and the 4th beats in the measure. So we'll be doing an upstroke immediately after both chops. Should be down, down, up, down, down, up. Now we're going to try some extra strums in between the chops. So we have here down, down, up, down, up, down. Let's add one more upstroke here. So now we have down, down, up, down, up, down, up. Make sure that you're still accenting those chop beats, but you can let the other chords ring out a bit more. And if you're looking for a way to change things up, sometimes you can offset a chop by doing some syncopated strumming like this. Here we have down, 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 up, up. And lastly here, we have something that I've heard some people call a downbeat chop. And this is a technique that people might use at the beginning of a banjo solo or the beginning of a chorus to really help offset the beginning of this new section. So here we have down, up, down, down. For those last two strum patterns, I'd recommend using them pretty sparingly. That way, again, you're not ruining that rhythmic definition that we want to have for the rest of the band. So try all these strum patterns out over your favorite bluegrass chord progressions. And if you're looking for some standards, I'd recommend Blue Ridge Cabin Home or Your Love Is Like a Flower, because those chord progressions are really common. But it's still really hard finding a way to transition from one chord to the next and trying to keep all this other information in mind, like the bluegrass bark, all these strum patterns. It's pretty difficult. And that's exactly what we'll be looking at in the next video of this series. We'll check out how to transition from one chop chord to the next seamlessly without slowing down or dropping a beat. So check out the videos that you see on screen right here for more info on the chop chord. You can also check out the playlist there so you can see all the videos from start to finish in order. But lots more to come on this topic, so we'll see you soon.